Track, we discuss trends, and we're joined by Kathleen Leo, who is the Chief Legal Officer and General Counsel at Chobani Greek Yogurt, and discuss questions like what's the difference between a fad, trend, and movement, and provocations like trends dictate culture. And this conversation actually went to a lot of unexpected places, so I'm really excited for you to listen. And without further ado, enjoy the track. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. I'm Madison. I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and a special guest, which you will get to hear from in just a moment. And so tonight we're talking about trends, and we start off with a word association. So when you see your name on the screen, give a brief introduction and the 1 to 3 words you associate with the topic and why.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Maryam. I'm 17 and I'm from the suburbs of Chicago. I'm up first. So the 3 words that I associate with trends are social media and popular. I feel like those are all pretty self-explanatory, but just like coming into this, I feel like I have a negative connotation with trends because I feel like everyone's doing it, then it becomes like less unique, but that just might be like the unique mentality where it's like, oh, you have to do something different or original. So I'm excited to see where this goes tonight and if that changes.
You always put me up to the top, Madison. I'm always on the spot. My name's Thanasi. I'm 18. I'm from New York City. I think 3 words: powerful, violent, and unpredictable. And that's what I'm gonna go with for today.
Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm Angel, 18 from Maryland. Okay, not really 3 words. What do I think of? Fleeting, and superficial. Definitely echoing Maryam's point. I definitely come into this with a negative connotation of the word trend in mind. Fleeting is self-explanatory, superficial because just saying, for example, like over the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter becoming a trend, being used as like virtue signaling, performative activism without the substance that is necessary for actual change, but can be debated and it probably will be. So yeah.
Hey everyone, my name's Ashley. I'm 17. I'm from Vancouver, Washington. When I think of trends, I think about like pressure to conform. I don't know, I feel like it could be like positive or negative pressure, but there's just so much energy kind of just wanting you to like jump on the bandwagon and just go along with what everyone else is saying. So that is what I think of.
Hey guys, my name is Jacob. I'm 17 and I'm from Long Island, New York. And I guess when I think of trends, I think of like the phrase short-lived zombies, because what became really salient to me as somebody that's like into bands and metal is like resurgence of things that happened in the past. And so I think trends, like they have a moment, but then they can also have a moment after they die.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia. I would say the internet and ever-changing, probably to the point made earlier before I hopped on like social media. I just associate all the major trends with the internet now and ever-changing, because even like 2 years ago, I feel like trends were a little bit more long-term, like maybe like 2 to 3 months, and now trends are changing weekly just because of the current like state of the internet. So it's interesting.
Maya?
Yep.
Hey, sorry about that. Hi, Kathleen Leo. I'm live in New York City, but I grew up in Ohio. I'm general counsel of Chobani. And when I think of trends today, I was thinking about the fact that we're going to talk about it. I think about how we're in this important tipping point. and that was going to be a trend a year ago is very different about what trends are going to evolve into in the next year, and how it's potentially going to change a lot of how we think about things. So I'm excited to have this conversation. So my 3 words are tipping point and evolution.
Hey, I'm Gary, one of the co-founders of CU, calling in from New York. Kind of in contrast of some of the other words being used, I'm going to put long time coming, because some trends could be really big macro trends that often are happening so slowly or so unceremoniously that we don't notice that they're happening, but they often have some of the biggest impacts on our lives, like climate change.
Yeah, and then I would say connection. I know that there is definitely or can be a negative aspect to trends, but something that makes them so powerful in a positive way is the connection that they can bring between people. Gary and Kathy, I don't know how much you use TikTok, but I know that TikTok definitely speaks to the way that trends can connect people. Like if people are like, oh, do you see this like recipe everyone's making, or like this certain sound that's blowing up on TikTok? It's like an instant connection between people who like previously like wouldn't have a way to like feel that sense of connection before. So that's what I think about. But thank you all for sharing your words, and now we can go ahead and get on to the actual conversation. So does anyone have a question or provocation to get us started off with? Okay, if not, I
have one. I have one.
Okay.
I have many. I was just trying to figure out like the most broad one. And I think it's something of like, why do trends last so like, why did trends used to last longer and why do they not last as long now? I think that's how I'll kick it off.
As somebody who is much older than you guys, I would say one reason is just media, right? Media, they come and go. When I grew up, like trends lasted for a long time because, the information was there for much longer. Now it's so quick, and the media and social media causes it to be quick. The iterations are quicker for some trends.
Yeah, also just like the funnel we've been going through, like just like from movies to YouTube, which is a slightly short form content, all the way down to TikTok now, which is max 60 seconds. So just like our attention spans are much shorter. And then like all just like with what we're watching, not only that, but also just like, yeah, everything that we're interested in, our attention spans are a lot shorter too.
Yeah, I mean, I always used to wonder if it's like, if the trends last shorter because the content is just quicker, or if it's because our brains have just become like, we just spend less time on things. And I don't know which one's true, but all I know is that like, I watch week by week people like become just so different every week based on the trends. And it's hard to wrap my head around. I don't know.
I think it like intertwines. It's like a result of us being more into short form content.
How do you define a trend?
That's actually a really good question.
I guess to me at least, like a trend is something that dies. Like it has a moment, like say like a hit song on the radio. Like if you guys remember like Gangnam Style or Despacito, like being a worldwide phenomenon. But then like people get sick of the song eventually and then it dies. So I saw that as a trend.
Yeah, I would just say that's not the case for all trends, right? Like the increase in carbon in the atmosphere is a trend that without our intervention is going to destroy us. So,
right.
Yeah, trends can definitely mean fashion trends though, basically like cultural trends that stop after a while.
They can mean healthy eating as well, like something that just evolves and changes. The way people work. People are going to start working from home more. That's a trend. I mean, and I guess that goes to, is it short-lived or not short-lived? Or is it just an evolution?
So the question, one additional question is, what makes something shorter or longer lived? A trend.
I just want to get back to what Gary said, which is like completely right. There's different kinds of trends. Like the definition of the word trend can totally vary. So I have it up right now in Merriam-Webster. Like, one definition of trend is like a current style or preference. Which I suppose I was trying to think of. But then like there's another definition, which is a general movement over time, which is a much bigger picture, something that can last indefinitely long, like Gary was saying. So I totally see that.
I think there's two types, and the type I'm kind of interested in is like someone brought up performance activism. I don't know who it was, but like there's like trends that people do for themselves, and like people will kind of keep inside, like drinking a different type of I don't know, like bottled water or whatever. But then there's like outward trends that people want to conform with, and I think that's what I think of more when I think of trends, is like when people conform together.
And Gary, to answer like that other question, I don't know if today there's anything but short trends if we're thinking about it in the sense of like fashion or social media. Like, I mean, just like take fashion for instance. There's like a new line for every single season. Like people are in a constant search of something new. And like Kathy, you mentioned like, it hasn't always been the case, but I think that where we are at this point in time, I don't see many trends lasting longer than even a couple of months.
I don't know if this is necessarily like related or a separate thread, but I'm also curious to hear like what people's thoughts are on like if trends are necessarily new, because like in terms of fashion, I feel like a lot of things just make a like reemergence, like, oh, this was popular maybe in like the 90s or the 80s and now it's like popular again. Like, is there any real innovation there? Or like even things as basic as like, I don't know how many of you all are like on TikTok, but like the feta pasta was like crazy on TikTok like a little while ago, and then last year it wasn't the same pasta, but it was like a different pasta that was really popular like at the same time, and it's like, oh, that's funny that like before it was like Gigi Hadid's pasta, now it's like this feta pasta that, and like it's kind of like the same, it follows like almost like a cyclical pattern. So I'm like curious as to like whether they're really new or they're just kind of like re-emerging, or like what sort of innovation goes into these trends, and what everyone's thoughts are on that. I think that there's no new thing under the sun, and rather what makes them seem innovative is, I guess, the costume that it's placed in. I think that goes for a lot of things, whether it be fashion. We see like there is a recurrence. I mean, like a couple years ago it was 90s fashion. Now it's progressing into like retro or whatever. Same thing with music. Yeah, I really don't think that trends are necessarily new, even if you want to make the case for the pattern definition of the word trend. Even like baked into the very sense of that word, or that connotation, a trend isn't new, right? It's something that continues to reoccur. That's what makes it a trend under that framework. So no, I don't think that
there's also those jokes on the internet how like no one has an original thought, like everything that you come up with and everything like you like anything, like even if it's a painting that's like no one's seen before, they're still like taking inspiration from things that are very, very much already real. So I guess like, yeah, nothing is really new exactly. But
I mean, I'd like to think that we're constantly innovating. I mean, look at technology. If you look back, we were using 40 years ago rotary phones. So, there is, I would like to think, innovation, and certainly there are, iterations, like certainly fashion is a huge one, right? Fashion gets kind of re-engineered and evolved in different ways, but I think certainly technology brings on new innovation and new fads. And I think the question also, what's the difference between a trend and a fad?
I think my answer to that would be probably a trend is something that makes lasting change in like a culture or a society. Like I can't think of a trend that I can think of off the top of my head that hasn't left like an impact, but a fad, like fads coming like parachute pants. I don't know if that was just in my high school, but like they just wore parachute pants for like a month and then no one else wore parachute pants. I was very confused, but I don't think that made a lasting effect on my culture. Gary's giving me a scowl, so I don't think the parachute pants example was a good one.
No, I'm just surprised that that was a thing that Gen Z did.
This also makes me want to pose a provocation that trends dictate culture.
I just want to comment that like it's clear that there's like different people have different like strong connotations with the word trend, and we're not even like we're not like qualifying our statements often when we're saying it. It's like, oh, there's no new trend. It's like, okay, depending on your definition, right? Like there's a real trend of getting the world to buy into plant-based meat, which is not possible before. So how is that new, right? Well, part of it's not part of it's not new, which is like animal rights, vegetarianism, etc. Right? But there's a lot that changes all the time, right? Like that's unprecedented.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
my point earlier to that, like, because I didn't mean like there's like no new trends, but it's like, yeah, they always like snowball from probably like a past trend, like you're saying, like the plant-based movements, like it's kind of snowballed from something within the realm, not exactly it. So it is like new in a way, but yeah, that's what I kind of meant earlier. But.
And Gary, that in some ways, that's why I was trying to draw the distinction between trend and fad. Right? For me, a trend can be creating more inclusive cultures. How we take on our entertainment, consumerism. Are we more or less, consumers than we used to? So to me, I feel like sometimes, at least in the way I look at trends, that it's something larger than the way people are dressing. But I mean, I guess that's trend. That could be, it just depends on your definition.
There's this book that talks about trends and how the ones that are most impactful can't be predicted. But I often wonder if it's the other way around, Madison, if it's culture dictates trends or if it's trends that dictate culture. And I don't know if that's a chicken or the egg paradox, but I don't think it is. I think there is a right answer. I just don't know what it is.
Thanasi, it's funny that you say that because when I knew I wanted to pose a provocation like this, and I was thinking of flipping it around, like culture dictates trends as well. So I think it's a good question.
Well, I have a question. What's the difference between a trend and a movement? Because I feel like, to me, like plant-based eating and that kind of stuff, that feels more like a movement to me. Like the long-term stuff feels more like a movement to me, while like the more superficial stuff feels like I associate that with trends, I would say.
That's a good point.
Well, then I would ask, like, there's a real shift. I'm just going to deliberately avoid trend here. There's a shift to calling out centralization of power and decentralizing power, but it's hard to say that it's a movement. It's like a meme, and it's like a bunch of philosophies that are sort of like synchronizing. Ironically, the decentralization movement, if there is one, is very decentralized, just like many movements. So and where is there, I guess where is there a trend that doesn't have people deliberately trying to create it? Or I don't know. Maybe that's one question for us to think about.
I would have to push back on that and ask whether or not a movement has to be centralized to be considered like a viable movement. I would consider a lot of the most pervasive movements to not have like a central figure or a central institution that's pushing for change. Like,
did I say that movements can only have a centralized authority?
No, you didn't necessarily say that, but I mean, when I hear the word centralized, like that is what comes to mind. But I will concede that centralization could also mean centralized over a certain idea or centered around an idea. But then I feel like that's just the definition of a movement. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I think if a trend is centralized, then it's not really a trend. You can't have a bunch of humans say that they're making a trend when it's like a couple people telling them what to do. I just don't.
I think that happens. I think that probably it probably happens a lot, right? There's, Trump had meme factories. Like he was pumped. It's this thing where, I mean, it's a dynamic system where you influence the culture on a wider scale, where it takes on a life of its own, right? And this is often the issue with people that play a sort of politics where the ends justify the means, but then the means that they're trying to engineer the ends create a culture that they can't even control anymore. And I think that's probably what's happening with the QAnon, where there's probably some kind of short-term tactical advantage that some people were trying to engineer, right? But now it's very decentralized. And it's, so I guess I would just call out that often when there's clearly a lot of decentralized actors at one point in time, it could be very possible that a centralized authority was masterminding the seeding of that trend, that culture, right? That then diffuses over time to all sorts of people that autonomously, in a decentralized fashion, want to accelerate the trend.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. Like, I think most of the trends that we're seeing right now are seeded from like a centralized location. That's why you're getting so many trends that seem like they're repeats, because when you look at the people who own the media companies, like they're playing the same things over and over. Like I was reading this, I was reading this book, and it was talking about how like the top hit on the radio, like the length of each like top hit has been like longer and longer now, because like all of the radio channels are owned by like central, like ownership of the channels have like become more centralized, and so they just play the same things over and over, so it becomes like a trend for longer. And so I think there's a lot to be said about like who is in the backseat actually driving what becomes a trend, and are all of these like, I don't know, just is it really like, is this trend really emerging from like a decentralized place where like it's people making their own decisions that like this is something cool and they want to hop on board, or is it actually being coordinated by like, I don't know, or like are there underlying factors that are causing people to want to make it a trend? I'm sorry if that didn't make sense.
It made sense.
Yeah, I think that there's like you can seed a trend, but then you kind of lose control. Like, can you imagine like if like the feta pasta thing on TikTok, right? Kids from like a rural like province in Southeastern Asia and the middle of New York City were making the same exact pasta dish, right? If they could get their hands on feta and tomatoes, which is pretty much very abundant. So imagine if like a company, right, or something can harness the power of that trend or figure out how to make something trend that much. but then I feel like you lose it once you put it out into the world. Once you put it out to like millions of people, you can't really control the trend anymore. And it's a big risk to take. So maybe there is a centralized, like with QAnon, I don't think anyone who was messing around with QAnon like 6 years ago or 4 years ago, or whatever, could have imagined that they would have created what they created, you know?
Yeah, well, I think one of the creators of that whole thing or related kind of radical like ideology has fessed up and has really regretted it because it's totally out of his control now. It started off as jokes, right, and then and then it just evolves into really kind of a monster, which is the real power of social media right now. And on the note of like the viability of seeding trends, I mean, I know people whose livelihoods are based on creating cultural trends on TikTok and Twitter, right? And they screenshot me, look at the hashtag that I made trend today, like. So it happens all the time.
Yeah, well, for this question, like I was just like looking at stuff, and I think this is a good explanation. Movements don't come and go. Movements come and stay until they're no longer needed because the world has totally changed or because technology no longer requires them. It gives the example of like restaurants putting bacon on everything was a trend, but the adoption of healthier, sustainable eating is a movement. I think that's also the same with like innovation. I think of innovation as a constant movement, not a trend.
I think that just the past thread that's been going on all relates back to the previous question that Madison posed. And I don't know, I feel like this is probably like intuitive to all of us, but it's definitely not one way. I feel like it's reciprocal. The trends dictate the culture, but at the same time, the culture like engineers the parameters for the trends to take place in, right? So like literally so many people have said previously, there can be a trend and then someone loses control of it and then it's just embedded into like the social fabric, right? And then that becomes the culture, and then that culture therefore defines what will next become a trend or what can become a trend. So yeah, I think it's definitely a reciprocal process, and it's not like one way.
What are some good examples of one way or the other? Trends dictating culture and culture dictating trends. I always think about gay marriage that happened in the end very quickly.
Oh, such a great question, Kathy. Oh my God.
And so, and there are a lot of other things, movements or that have not happened that quickly. And that one I felt like happened very quickly. And why was that, right? Was it cultural, that it just became, I know, I always think about that. It was, what was the tipping point that caused that?
Yeah.
That was culture, that was the cult. I don't know. I mean, I pose that as a question more than anything.
I feel like that's an example of people. I don't consider that a trend, to be honest. Because
a movement.
like, yeah, definitely a movement.
Right.
I mean, LGBTQ activists have been, organizing since forever. And rather, I feel like that their organizing resulted in a culture shift that enabled politics or the people in charge to say, hey, we're going to make this into a law. So yeah, I don't think that one's a trend.
I also think like with the internet, like self-expression has never been so like inherent until the internet came around. And so again, like that snowball effect of both culture and a movement because of the internet, and being able to voice those on such a large scale and really push for change, like worldwide. Anyone can send out a tweet and reach millions of people and make an impact.
I think a good like trend culture thing I like to think about is like health and wellness when it comes to like vegetarianism and veganism. I think that's like it's always been a thing, but it's just becoming more and more prevalent. And I think that's kind of a trend that is changing the underlying culture of the way people think of food. I think in like 50 years, we'll probably all be canceled for eating meat. But like I think that's where we're going. But I think that a trend, like a health trend, has influenced the culture, which is then, like Angel said, influenced another trend that just keeps snowballing down. It's like this like node of change that wipes through a system.
I agree, and I feel like social media allows us to influence culture a little bit more, because before, if like people were into something niche and like nobody in their area was like into that niche topic, you couldn't really like reach a lot of people and start like forming like a mass movement or a trend or like any sort of culture change. But now you can probably connect really quickly and easily to people who are like into the same things as you. And oat milk, yes. Okay, I'm like the biggest oat milk advocate. So Kathleen, you put that in the chat. Okay, but anyway, so yeah, there's like not that many people in my school that drink oat milk, but online there's like a whole lot of people who are like only oat milk lattes, and now like I can find people. So I feel like it's just like it's like easier to influence culture, because not that people are like emboldened by the fact that like other people are into the same things as them, but like you're not as ostracized because there are people that are out there, and now you can actually connect with them. So that was kind of a roundabout way of putting it, but yeah.
I was listening to this podcast on like mob mentality, and what I found so interesting was you can kind of see inflection points. They were talking about gay marriage. They were talking about how like there were so many events like Stonewall that happened, right? And there were so many events that just didn't catch fire because the network wasn't perfectly aligned, like the social fabric wasn't aligned for it to catch on. And so what they deduced was that trends kind of happen, but in order for a trend to happen, it needs to be like perfectly timed in a network so that people can buy into it, and then the people that trust them can buy into it, and eventually it can flow. And I would just, this is a personal thing, but it would just be super cool to eventually be able to map that and like see that in real time and see that flow. And that would help a lot of people understand a lot of things about the internet.
Yeah, and I think that this is like making me realize that it's not one way or the other. I think it's that trends are very representative and telling of like where we are at a certain point in time with our culture, and because like of that perfect timing and like how well it fits within, like obviously like Gary, you were talking about how people like are able to create trends, but they're able to do that because it already, part of it already resonates with people in the culture. And so I mean, once you're able to create a trend that is based on the culture, it can influence.
Great point.
So
yeah. Great point. Like for example, we have a culture of political retribution and like lack of the opposite of mercy, right? Resentment, and all sorts of trends, right? Including cancel culture. Ironically, it's called culture, right? But it's like, it's a trend, right? We're only canceling people more and more, right? And like what that reveals is like, and like we literally have people that dig through people's tweets from like 15 years ago. And that's such a great like barometer for culture. Culture, I'd say it's generally, it takes a little more time, I think, to think about like the qualities of a culture, right? But it's easy, but the kind of, I think a good relationship is like the trends help us, they're kind of the more manifested elements of the culture.
They're almost incremental. So each little trend builds into the larger and how the culture evolves.
This is a side note, but to Gary's point, I've noticed lately in terms of cancel culture, tweets haven't been coming up really in people's points. And so I actually tried to search, like I've had Twitter since like 2012, I think. And I actually tried to search old tweets, and it wasn't letting me go back anymore. It's like not even scrolling, like searching tweets back before 2019 now. So I think they like are not letting people see past a certain point to like try to avoid that. Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's interesting how public facing corporations can be so in favor of trends. Like I think of this summer, like so many companies and all those things were like going for Black Lives Matter, and then would be like, okay, time to go back to paying our workers nothing. see you later. And I just like, is it possible to just ride a trend and use it for, what is greenwashing? Is it possible to use a trend, just ride it for clout?
Okay, 100% yes. I think but greenwashing is basically this new thing, not necessarily new, but this thing that companies do where they proclaim that they're sustainable, but then if you really look underneath the covers, there's a lot of shady stuff going on. Like you say that you divest from a certain thing, but yet you're still like investing money into some other company along the supply chain, right? So yeah, I mean, 100% trends are used for clout for sure, especially by corporations, I would say.
Yeah, and that's like the basis of social media half the time. So,
I mean, companies are of course going to do that because they're going to try to get consumers and or investors and try to be on the right side of what is right at that point in time. I mean, that's why everybody came out this summer. They were forced to. They didn't have a choice. And companies that stayed quiet were, people did not look favorably upon them. And I think to the point is, are we as a society going to hold companies accountable, right? Do you guys purchase goods based on whether companies do what's right by the environment, by their employees? Because they're going to do what's in their own best interest.
Yeah, I think that we definitely can't
Mostly.
blame, I would say, like, we definitely can't blame companies for wanting to take part in these trends, whether it be like sustainability or Black Lives Matter or anything else. I just think like the distinction comes in like when you figure out like what's actually being done. Like I was trying to search for a documentary that I watched the other day, but it was like Angel brought up clothing lines, like literally it's like the smallest percentage of like, I saw one and it was like they were able to consider it sustainable because literally the tag on it was sustainable or something like that. And it's like absolutely absurd. And so like that's where it gets like, that's not really holding people accountable. It's just like letting the company's virtue signal, which is something completely different and I don't think really acceptable. So then I guess the question is like, how do we like actually hold them accountable? Because obviously a lot of these trends do come up for a reason.
Fully agree. Like and like a lot of people that I talk to, like they're like, oh, so many companies are doing fast fashion, so we shouldn't support them anymore. Like, let's shop at H&M because they're eco-friendly and they say that they're super like economic or like environmentally friendly and conscious or whatever, and they recycle things and they're so good for the environment, so let's support them. And then it's like really problematic because they clearly aren't, but they brand themselves as a company that is, and like all over their stores they have things that like proclaim themselves as like supporting the environment. And so like it's almost misleading to people. Well, it is misleading to people because they want to like hop on this trend, and like most people have a short enough attention span, whereas like if someone is like, oh, this company did this, and be like, oh, but they're blah, 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 and they can kind of just like move on quickly. And I feel like, yeah, obviously companies will want to hop on the trend, and most people will like move on quick enough for them to like continue supporting the company. But I think it is like really important for us as like consumers to hold them accountable, because like I feel like they're just getting away with a lot of things, and like they're not going to change if it works out for them, because like obviously like it's not in their interest to do that. So definitely something to think about.
Yeah, I agree, but I also want to push back just a little, just to play devil's advocate. I feel like this narrative on having the consumers hold these companies accountable is a little bit unfair as well. I feel like it primarily lies in like the power dynamics between the two groups. Corporations, companies have a vast amount of resources, and yes, our consumers contribute to those resources, but I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of nuanced discussion to be had about consumer accountability and corporate accountability. And And I guess that also not reminds me, but I'm also, it brings up the question of corporate social responsibility. And I don't know, just like the trend that's taking on lately, and how, whether or not you believe that's virtue signaling, performative activism, or if it's a genuine desire to see change in corporate practices.
Yeah, I think that like something Ashley said, and I think we discussed it on a track like a while ago of sometimes when movements get such notoriety and they become a trend, it like diminishes the power of the movement, because it's a lot easier to just release a statement or do something like in favor of go back to Black Lives Matter, but also gay marriage or whatever big trend. But it's a lot harder to actually work to create like more equitable systems. And when things are trendy, people just are really quick to gloss over them and just make sure you have the box checked. And I think it's really harmful when a lot of these huge, like, I don't know, just releasing a statement, it makes people think that the problem is being solved by these big corporations, when in reality, very few people, period, actually are working to solve the problem, but a lot of them are acting like they do. I don't know if that made sense.
No,
Yeah.
we go, Madison.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember, I think it was like 2015, there was just this wave and like all these companies added a sustainability tab to their websites and they're like, oh, wiped my hands clean. Like, and then it's like, it was just this wave of that happened. And I remember it was kind of overwhelming because it's like, how do we even know that there's probably truth to obviously what they have on their website, but there's probably so much that they're not saying of what they aren't doing that's sustainable practices. It's kind of like, oh, this is what we are doing that's sustainable, but there's probably a longer list of things that they aren't doing that completely like wipes that out, which is interesting. So, yeah.
But it's good, I would argue, that at least they're reacting, right?
Yes,
it's an evolution, not a revolution.
Yeah.
And so, and there will be companies that put stuff up there and there are not a lot of truth to them. And there are ones that are actually maybe trying to get there and trying to figure out how to get there. And I think there's peer pressure or competitive pressure. You know, if the company that I compete against, you know, does have, let's take sustainability, has actually a real sustainability program, and consumers are going to purchase based on that program, then it becomes competitive. So I do think as consumers, we have power, right? If we choose to try to figure out which companies are true to what they're saying versus ones that are just saying it because they think that is the right thing to do, and there's nothing really behind it.
Yeah, I mean, and just to Angel's point, I think that like we sometimes do really underestimate how much power we do have as consumers. I mean, this isn't directly correlated, but like, look at what happened with the stock market a couple weeks ago. Like, a few people on Reddit just completely like made a bunch of like rich people lose like millions of dollars because of like a trend like that they wanted to create or whatever. So I mean, that's definitely true, Kathy. Anyone have what's the stock market? Anyone have anything else to add to this provocation before we move on to reflection?
Just like in general, I had this kind of idea come up, and feel free to break it down. But like that trends are like superficial, like they're the cutting edge and thing that you recognize immediately about the current cultural moment. Whereas like a movement is something that's more abstract or political. Like we have a movement towards having, you know, a greener culture. We have a movement towards having more financial equality, or at least, you know, reducing inequality. Whereas like it could be a trend to only shop at places that, you know, have cardboard silverware or, you know, whatever. And so then I feel like culture is a reflection of like all the movements that have happened in the past. I feel like movements can come when trends are taken seriously. I know, for example, like I think it was Coco Chanel, like she created a new cut for women's clothing. And then that new cut of like, you know, I think it was a new kind of suit cut for a jacket. Made people like think about like, you know, is it appropriate for a woman to be wearing a man's clothing? And like, what does it have to be like in order for that to be acceptable? And that created this entire new discussion about like, you know, what is it okay for a woman to wear? And like what should be accepted as acceptable fashion. And so then that became a new movement, and it all started with a single person with an idea that became a trend, that became a movement, that then gets ingrained into culture.
That was a really good summary of everything, and I think that's a good place for us to transition to a reflection. So I'm going to send the notes in the Zoom chat so that you all can look over them and kind of think about what your key takeaways are, and I can go ahead and just get us started off while you are looking. And based on what Jacob said and what all has been talked about during this conversation, I'm almost wondering if like trends inform what actually becomes lasting movements, because I like what Jacob said there about like culture is a reflection of all the movements that have happened in the past. So there's like these trends that compound into movements, and then also just like I love the provocation on corporate responsibility and how we actually think about like Maria mentioned like it's hard. Consumers are so easily to kind of like be tricked into like thinking like, oh, I don't know, like this clothing is sustainable, or like this food is healthy for me, or whatever. And so how do we like legitimately hold corporations accountable to that, and make sure that like their participation in trends or movements is not virtue signaling? And how do we like really leverage that consumer power as well?
I think mine, adding on to what you said, is probably on the corporate side. I don't know if I think there's like a way to leverage, like, even if they are like virtuously signaling or whatever, I think there's a way to leverage that to create actual good. And I don't know if it's, before we had that conversation, I thought it was probably all bad and all negative, but I don't know if that's the truth. And I also now realize that I was definitely wrong about it's definitely the chicken or the egg, because I think it is a cyclical advancement of society through culture and trends. And so, yeah, it's just, this conversation has opened up so many more questions about trends for me.
In that same vein, like my reflection is also kind of like in the corporate conversation that we've been having, but more so along the lines of trends in terms of social justice allow people to get comfortable, sometimes too comfortable. And so like again, back to what Madison was saying, like tricked into thinking that like the problem is solved. And so I think my reflection is more thinking on how we can continue challenging people once it does become a trend, so that it's not just like a black square and then we've ticked the box and like everything is great, and you know it can actually have sustainable change, because we don't want people to just get comfortable and think that the problem is solved. So definitely more thinking to do with that. But
Hey, this is Kathy. So, I mean, I guess I think it's been great and interesting conversation about the difference between trends, movements, and then I go back to fads, because I think of fads as very just short-lived. And when I think about trends before we were coming into this conversation, I think about them that they're building upon each other and then they're causing change in the long run. So whether it's eating or whether it's the environment or whether it's social responsibility, they are trends in my mind that then build into something bigger and gain steam and potentially change our culture. So I think the way that they're all intertwined is interesting. And I think I hadn't thought about it that way before this conversation.
I completely echo that. The conversation made me think about what trends allowed for Civics Unplugged to exist. Like, could we have existed 2 years, like let's say 3 years ago, or 4 years ago? Unclear, right? Because we're riding the trend of people being more comfortable with digital environments. We're riding the trend of people recognizing that our civic education is horrible or non-existent in most places. We're riding the trend that people realize how connected everything is across nations, across people, for a lot of reasons, how shocks in one area ripple out to everywhere else. We're riding the trend that of the increasingly common recognition that democracy is really fragile and requires a kind of consistent vigilance. And the list goes on. And so, but I hadn't really fully formulated how we are one of those examples that is trying to kind of both, let's say we're both trying to surf these waves, these trends, while also trying to direct them into systems change. Because on their own, they're sort of like kind of going out on their own, right? But like, how do we connect all these dots and create like a real force to be reckoned with?
I mean, adding on to what Gary said, especially what they brought up earlier tonight, I think Gary and Thanasi were talking about this. Like, is it possible to manufacture trends? And it kind of is. As looking into the future, like, what can we do so that we can, create trends, or at least surf the wave that is the current moment, and then do the most possible good out of what's happening right now.
I think it's cool how we kind of, the big question at the beginning, it's like, what do we consider trends? It seemed like we were all on different pages, but the more we got into the conversation, like we made the differences between trends, movements, and like Kathleen said, fads. So that was like a really important distinction because they all play their own roles into the world daily. And that really helped the conversation move forward, which is cool to see.
Yeah, I think the relationship between trends and culture was really interesting to me. I mean, like I like that we touched on CSR, and I guess like to me, like I think CSR is a joke, especially when, I mean, like, well, it's a joke when businesses, like entire business models are not designed for social responsibility. So it's like they're just trying to like cancel out what they were intended to do with like, I don't know, band-aid actions. But like I am interested in how, I don't know, how do we create more of those macro trends, or at least trends that don't cancel out the movements but actually add on to them, so we can shift like how these businesses are actually like built and designed and like their purpose, and not just like their performative actions.
Yeah.
Can I just add? Oh, go ahead, Angel.
Oh, go ahead. It's fine.
No. I wanted to respond to that because I think I have a great example. Is that when I joined Chobani, we hire refugees. About 30% of our workforce is refugees. And so when I joined 4.5 years ago, it was not in vogue to do that. And we were out and we were talking about it and we were proud of it. And so I said to, and we saw obviously our product throughout the country. And so I said to our CMO at the time, like, do we care that people in certain parts of the country would not be supportive of the fact that we, hire refugees, right? Because it was, when Trump was elected, it was during the bans. And what he said was, then they're not our consumers, right? We don't care. We're going to do what is the right thing to do. And I do think, guys, there are plenty of companies out there that want to do the right thing, but that's where it just becomes change. It happens. And now a lot of companies are doing it, right? So it's just incremental, and you have to, support in whatever. I mean, I just think you have to support it in your consumerism and when you get jobs, like you work for companies that you're proud of what they're, willing to do. So anyway, I don't believe it should be, there are a lot of companies that are doing the right thing.
I eat Chobani like every day, so.
Yeah, and I wasn't saying it, I was only actually giving it as an example, is that I think companies have a lot of constituents. They have business, they have investors, they have consumers, they have their employees, and it's a balancing act. But I do think our culture is evolving in that respect.
Yeah, Kathy, I really appreciate what you said. I think it's so necessary for us. Well, I mean, if we're ever speaking or reflecting specifically on the CSR conversation and the little thingy before that, I think it's so important for us as consumers, as society, as the people to uplift and praise these companies that are actually doing the right thing. starting a trend under that framework would probably allow us to change the culture so that CSR is more less hypocritical and more substantial in a sense. And it's really just highlighting the necessity of just strong, dedicated and determined campaigners who are willing to expose like what is underneath the covers. There's this, I brought this up earlier, not this meeting, but there is this organization, Sierra Club. Their Beyond Coal campaign has been revolutionary in starting a trend and now a movement into moving away from coal and into more cleaner, renewable technologies, because they're going into these communities, they're telling them the lies that these corporations or the utility industry has been telling them, which aren't necessarily true and are especially harmful to their communities. And just exposing those lies, exposing the hypocrisy has been so necessary, so integral into creating like this positive movement. So there's definitely a role for consumers, and there's definitely a role for consumers, and there's a need for consumer education. Yeah.
All right. I think, Gary, you can go ahead and stop screen sharing. I just have one question I want to ask. So Kathy, since this was your first trek, would love to hear your thoughts on just the trek overall.
First of all, you guys are an amazing group. I can't believe you're only high schoolers. And it's just great that you guys are creating this forum for you to iterate and share ideas. It's not, and again, let's talk about trend. You couldn't do this before Zoom and video conferencing. The idea that you can all get together from your homes all over the country. And, so happy to be a part of it. So thank you for including me.
Yeah, loved having you. It's super cool. It's been cool to see how the trek has changed over time, just become something that's just been so enjoyable for all of us. But yeah, loved having you. Would love to have you at a future trek, because we have these like literally all the time. We love them. And so, just let us know if you want to be on a future one. And
I would love to.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And thank you all for taking the time out of your night, and I will see you later. Bye.
Thank you, Madison. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.